Hi BookTube and welcome to a new video. This is a recent reads for 6 books. Boulder by Eva Baltasar, Catalonian writer, translated by Julia Sanchez. The Tartar Steppe by Dino Buzzati, translated by Stuart C. Hood. Percival Everett, I Am Not Sidney Poitier. 99 Interruptions by Charles Boyle. Camilla Grudova, who's Canadian, Children of Paradise, and finally Springer's Progress by David Markson. Okay, so let's start with the Eva Baltasar, Boulder. So this is about a young woman, who basically doesn't want to be tied down, wants to sort of just live her life as it comes along, and to facilitate that she's a galley cook on a ship that does sort of regular passages across and down the Latin American coast, and even when the ship pulls into port she only ever leaves to buy cigarettes, alcohol, tampons and socks. So she's sort of very self-contained, and she likes the sort of anonymity of it all. But one day she spots an Icelandic woman at one of the stops that they've pulled into, and they begin an intermittent affair, because obviously she's on the high seas and the Icelandic woman only goes to the port in order to travel inland for her studies. But eventually they decide that they're going to make a go of it when the Icelandic woman is offered a job back home in Iceland. So the protagonist has sort of forced to sort of compromise and sort of give up almost parts of her own self in order to do this. So they land up in Iceland and they're living together. She makes a sort of small industry for herself by opening up a sort of mobile food van, making tamales, and it's very successful. And she doesn't really sort of mix with the locals, but she does have a sort of non-judgmental friend who's an alcoholic bar owner, an older man who doesn't judge her. And then her lover drops an absolute bombshell on her that she, in order to complete the relationship as she sees it, she wants them to get in vitro fertilization and have a child together, which is sort of goes against everything that this woman. You know, she doesn't see herself as a mother. She doesn't want to be tied down, but she goes with it, and this builds up to a really, I'd say pleasing in a sort of an icky way, conclusion to their relationship. But you know, that's the plot. I just thought this was fabulous. I think the author is a poet as well, and this is very lyrical. I could open this up, and maybe I will do when I finish speaking about it. I open up at any page and there's just some beautiful writing. It's really good on relationships. It's really good on the compromises this woman makes and the decision-making processes behind, you know, why she sort of gives up another part of herself. I just thought it was a fabulous read, 5 stars. So I'm just going to open at random and see if if my grand claim for it is true. The dates have changed too, like every year. September ends, exhausted of light. Icelanders cling to it with a hunger that is vibrant and vulnerable, with a touch of destitution. It's time to fit the houses to sweep, tidy and stockpile food. During these weeks, empanadas fly off the shelves so fast it doesn't make sense. I work more than ever and it's still not enough. Samsa offers to come help one evening. I turn her down. I know she thinks it would be an adventure. I know she loves me. I know we barely see each other. But I need to keep her away from this thing that's all my own. The spice-filled, close-quartered food truck where I cook recipes that made me happy back when all I had was an endless rain too loose to guide my heart, and where nothing at all depended on me. It was empanadas, not tamales. Anyway, 5 stars. And I've bought her previous novel, which is called Permafrost, similar length to this, very short, and I'm looking forward to reading that. And this is published by And Other Stories, so this is the first of my in December reads. I've got 3 out of the 6 books I held up. The Tartar Steppe by Dino Buzzati. Now, I'd never heard of this book, and there's a video I made called 50 Books to Read Before You Die, the hipster version, which I'll post a link to, why I've dubbed it the hipster version. It's all to do with where I bought this sort of wall chart that listed the books and the area of London it came from. Anyway, so this was on it, never heard of it, did a bit of research, only just really got round to buying it and reading it this year. So it's about a young, newly commissioned military officer who's looking forward to sort of making his career in the army, and his first posting is to this rather forlorn, remote fortress on the edge of the Tartar Steppe. And when he gets there, he's a bit sort of displeased that it's sort of so out of the way and there's going to be no action. He thinks it's not, it's not going to be the exciting military adventure that he had imagined. But the officer says, look, give it 3 months, see how you go. And gradually, he's more and more sucked into the rather enervating life that goes on there. I mean, this book reminded me of so many things, although it predates some of them. So it reminded me of Boyle's film The Exterminating Angel, which is a dinner party of the bourgeoisie. And gradually, one by one, they start dying, and yet none of them can leave the room, none of them can leave the party. There's an element of this, that he can't leave the castle or the fortress. There's also the sort of very Kafkaesque bureaucracy of the military life and all these sort of routines, which are sort of directed for discipline, but towards what? There's no war. They know there's going to be no invasion coming across the border. It's all, and that sort of makes it also a bit like Waiting for Godot by Samuel Beckett, that they're doing these routines and then they seize upon any slight change of something they spot out on the steppe and they sort of blow it up and make it much bigger than it really is, thinking that it might be an indication that they're finally going to see some action, and of course they never do. So it reminded me of that, and also that not just because Buzzati was Italian, but it did remind me of Italo Calvino, particularly that book of his called Our Ancestors, where there's a story about from the days of sort of knights and chivalry and all of that has come to an end, and there's this suit of armour which is empty inside but is still trying to live that chivalric life, which was a brilliant metaphor. And there's an element of that here. It's quite, this was written in 1945, I think, but the soldiers and everything are portrayed are much more antiquated than 1945. They seem to be harking back to the sort of Napoleonic era or just after. So all of these great things that it echoed off in me, even though nothing really happens in this book. But what you gradually realise, it's a meditation on how we choose to use our one-off deals that is called life. How do we fill our lives? What do we spend our time doing? He has this great passion of all things, military and everything, but it's empty, it's hollow. And the more that he stays on at this castle, the more he sort of is aware that time is slipping through his grasp. He sees how his body is aging, his hair goes grey, etc. Time is measured in terms of deaths of his fellow officers and their retirements when they leave the fort. But everything really stays still. And it's also, not only is it meditation on how we use our lives, how we fill our lives, but it's also a meditation on death. Because he goes from being a very young officer at the start of this book to being grey-haired and wizened and, finds it hard to walk and all that sort of stuff. So it creeps up on you. It's a very subversive book, I feel. 4 stars. And my third Percival Everett of the year, I'm Not Sidney Poitier, which before the trees was probably his most well-known one. And this is my 10th Percival Everett, so I've finally hit double figures, and I'm still only a third of the way through his fiction oeuvre. And like the last one I read, which was Dr. No, and I'll leave the link to that, which is his latest work, was published this year, this is a bit sort of meh to me. It has all the usual Percival Everett elements of postmodernism, lots of good gags, some stuff about ethnicity and how you are treated differently according to the colour of your skin. So all of that stuff is there, as appears to be in most of his books. And I did think a lot of the individual set pieces and exchanges between characters were great, were really entertaining. Well, the voices were so distinct that you could imagine them. There were lots of jokes. But the whole thing, the whole plot, the whole story left me a bit cold. It all basically, an 8-year-old boy is brought up by his mother to be. He has the spitting image of Sidney Poitier, so she calls him not Sidney Poitier, which, you know, cue lots of gags about, oh, so you're not Sidney Poitier. No, I am. That's my name, and variations thereof. But his mum dies. He's an orphan. And his mum was an early investor in CNN, Ted Turner's news media company. And Ted was always very grateful to her because she sort of helped him get off the ground. So he adopts this orphan when his mum dies and brings him to Atlanta. And the Ted Turner character in here is really funny because he's always he's got a restless mind. He's always firing these questions of non sequiturs to each other, but they're good questions. You know, why is this and not that? So they're very funny. And the other character, major character, is Percival Everett, who in here is a university professor who not Sidney is studying under, and this university professor is teaching the philosophy of nonsense. So cue a lot of, again, nonsense and non sequiturs and kind of crazy logic that goes nowhere. So those two characters I found really entertaining. But Sidney's actual journey from Atlanta, he then decides he's going to go back to California, but gets stuck in Alabama. All of that stuff, which is where the race and ethnicity comes in. As a plot, it wasn't very engaging. I like the small details of this book, but overall, as I say, I didn't get a huge amount out of it. Whereas some of his other books, not just The Trees, but books like Erasure and Glyph, have really good plots. Telephone is another one. So there's a great storyline that drives you through the novel, whereas I felt that was a bit lacking here. He goes on this rather aimless journey. So I gave this, I think, 3.5 stars. And on to my second in December read. This is 99 Interruptions by Charles Boyle on CB Editions. CB standing for Charles Boyle, because this is a publishing company that he set up. It's not a vanity project because they published 80 books, and obviously not all 80 have been read by Charles Boyle. I've read one other Charles Boyle book, which is one of the first sort of post-Brexit novels called Robinson, based on Robinson Crusoe, for that sort of isolated little islander mentality projected across Britain that voted Brexit. It didn't quite work as a book, but it was very interesting. This is a whole different kettle of fish. This is what it says. This is 99 interruptions. So it's 99 aphorisms on the nature of interruptions. And there are some recurring themes. There's a lot of discussion about the relationship of fiction to real life, and brilliantly observed. His father, who's been dead for 65 years, who died when Boyle was a child, he sort of sees him and has conversations with him in some of these. And of course his father's life was interrupted by death, and yet Boyle Jr.'s life is interrupted by these visions of his father. So there are sort of two very clear-cut different types of interruption. And there's a lot of that about in here, that the ultimate interruption in our life is, of course, death. And I just think, you know, there's stuff about the Odyssey. You know, didn't Odysseus ever sort of turn around and think, how many more interruptions is there going to be before I get home to Ithaca? So I'm just going to read you a couple that really tickled me. So this is aphorism number 34. A cheval glass, a feather top with veil. I used to read novels, not least for the props, the clothes, the furniture, the food, the cigarettes, the cars. It was like looking into a drawer in my mother's bedroom. I didn't know what most of these things were, but they held the code for becoming a grown-up. Now I'm over 70. I read new novels as a code for being young, and it's indecipherable. I just think that's brilliant. And so true for people of my generation. I'm not quite 70, but I'm not far off. And another one, this is, I think from memory, was one of the things about fiction and reality. A book then, even one as short as this, is an interruption, which is itself often interrupted. While I'm reading it, my life is on hold. While I'm getting on with my life, the book is on hold. It's thought in Elizabeth Bowen's novel Eva Trout, puts it strongly, quote, "Life is an anti-novel. She sounds disappointed. She's renewing contact with another character she hasn't seen for years and is reflecting on the fact that nothing between them appears to have changed. As a reader of novels, change and development are what she has learned to expect, what keeps her turning the pages. But frankly, life doesn't give a fig about novels. It's the other way round. Novels, engineered by meaningless-seeking, pattern-making species, are a revenge upon life." Just superb. It may even get into my top 10 books of the year. Is it fiction? Is it non-fiction? I don't know. I guess if it's non-fiction, it probably doesn't get into my top 10 fiction of the year, so I might have to think about it and decide that. And on to Children of Paradise by Camilla Grudova. So I came across Camilla Grudova in her short story collection called The Dole Alphabet, which is published by Fitzcarraldo Editions in the UK. And quite frankly, whenever I read it, probably 2018 or 19, I can't remember exactly, that was the last collection of short stories that I enjoyed. Admittedly, I haven't read that many since because I'm so off them, but, you know, I remembered her name. And this is her debut novel. And it's about a young woman called Holly, who is sort of without employment, come to a new city, and she manages to land a job at the oldest cinema in the city, which is called the Paradise Cinema, which is very moth-eaten. It's one of those sort of labyrinths of lots of secret niches and forgotten areas and old screening rooms that no one uses anymore. And initially, none of the other staff talk to her because they just think that, like her predecessor, she won't last a week. So they're not going to entrust their secret club that they have and their other sort of perks of the job. But once she's sort of established herself that she's not going to leave them, then they bring her into the fold. And they're a ragbag cast of characters. They're all sort of youngish. They're all sort of fairly unemployable elsewhere. They're all on minimum wage and zero contracts. Some of the perks are, well, they're not supposed to, but they get to divvy up all the stuff they find abandoned in the cinema, which can be money, can be clothes, but it can also be drugs. Equally, the toilets and sometimes the seats themselves are filled with other human detritus, being sort of human effluent from all parts of the body. It's really grimy and horrible and disease-ridden. You know, all the food stuff in the cinema sells and where it makes its money. It's all old and off and has been contaminated by rats and mice. I mean, how the inhabitants of this city aren't sort of buried under a welter of Lyme's disease is a mystery. And the other secret is they have a secret film club. You know, after hours when they're not supposed to, they use the cinema to show films, or they show films in each other's houses. And bear in mind, they all live together, they all have sex with each other. It's a very, very hermetically sealed group. They have no other external interactions, which in a way makes you think, is the presentation of this group in a cinema, is it a film itself? You know, like a bunch of teenagers who go off into a remote cabin in the woods, obviously they'll then get sort of slaughtered. I'm not saying that, but I just felt that maybe this is a tilt of this is a sort of a filmic world for these characters in which they exist. They don't exist outside of it as much as it's a book. And the dotty old lady who owns this cinema and comes in every day and bothers them and stuff, she dies, and then the whole thing tilts, including the tone and in a way the genre of the book, because they're very afraid that that the cinema will be sold and become something non-cinematic, but actually it just gets brought up by a sort of modern cinema chain, which is equally offensive to them all. So it's a bit about sort of capitalism and globalization and sort of huge corporate chains, things like that. But what's odd is suddenly from nowhere we get a body count, and a very steeply rising body count. So it sort of lurches into the gothic. Only that didn't work for me at all. It didn't feel gothic, and nor did any of the deaths seem. It just seemed out of place, really. Unless there's some point about the cinema you know, wanting to preserve its integrity and consuming, but why prey on the staff, fork tooth and nail to keep it as it is. Anyway, I didn't like this book. The characters and the plots were totally uninvolving. I mean, they were so self-contained and hermetic that there's almost no way in for the reader. One of the characters is reading Godard on Godard, Jean-Luc Godard, the filmmaker, you know, his writings. Read that, you'll get much more out of it, because every chapter here is titled after a real film. And I don't know, I haven't seen all the films that were name-checked here, but I've seen a fair chunk of them. I couldn't see what that had to do with what then proceeded in the chapter. There didn't seem to be any tie-in at all. That's what I say, you know, I can imagine sort of cinema films like in this book, but then, as I say, they'd be more likely to read Godard on Godard and get more out of it than this book. And equally, if they also couldn't find the links between the titles and the chapters, they're going to get annoyed as well. And it turns out that the author, who is Canadian, has moved to Scotland, and her first sort of job here was as a cinema usher. So she knows what she's talking about. But so it's not that it's not authentic. I mean, it is perfectly well written, and it's sort of, a lot of the details, you know, smacks of authenticity. But I just couldn't see what this book was driving at, what the point of it was. So if you don't like the characters, the plot goes a bit mad in the second half. What have you got? Well, you've got some sort of commentary on cinema and capitalism, but I didn't buy that either. So this was really disappointing. 2.5 stars. And finally, David Markson. So I need a bit of preamble for this, I guess. As regular viewers of mine know, David Markson is my favourite author, but there are 3 stages of David Markson's career. In the 60s, he was writing commissioned pulp fiction stuff, none of which I've read. In the 70s, he published 2 novels, this, Springer's Progress, and another one called Going Down, which I read earlier in the year. And then in the 90s and early 2000s, which is very, very radical experimental stuff, which is what I love. So I'd read all the experimental stuff, loved it, wanted to track back to see the other stages of his career, because I knew they were very different. And Going Down, and again, I'll post the link to my review of that, is a very serious literary novel about a menage a trois of Americans, artists, in exile in Mexico. And it's very taut and sort of filled with tension, sexual tension and all that sort of stuff. But there's no gags in it. Not really. It's a serious treatment. And then you come to this, which I think preceded it, in terms of when it was published. And this is a riot. This is a hoot. I didn't realise David Markson was quite as sort of thigh-slapping funny as this book demonstrates. However, it is a white man's priapic obsession. And for that reason, a lot of people won't want to read it. And I understand that. It's of the 70s. I will say that I think it's far superior to the postmodernist writers like Coover. It's better than Philip Roth's Portnoy stuff, I think. It's the best of that genre, but in a way, in the sort of 2020s, why would anyone want to read the genre? I get it. I'm reading it because I want to trace Markson's journey to the pinnacle of what I see as fiction, which he reads. Anyway, it's basically a writer who's blocked called Lucien Springer. He has sort of 3 things in his life. One is writing, which obviously isn't going well. Another is he sort of has lots of one-night stands with women. And the third is he likes a drink, and he's a regular at this bar. He is married, does feel guilt. Actually, he doesn't feel guilt in the beginning because he thinks he's too, you know, he's covered his tracks. But he falls in love with this younger woman who's also a writer, and becomes obsessed with her. And they're both using each other to some extent. She's using him because he's mentoring her writing, and he reads through her manuscript and helps her and stuff. He's using her. Yes, there's a sexual relationship, but also he thinks that she's going to reignite his stalled writing project because he's going to write about their relationship. So now he's not so confident that he can cover his tracks to his wife. So there's a lot of, you know, sort of guilt-tripping himself about his wife. There's he can't get it up, or he can't make his girlfriend come. all this sort of male priapic stuff, which, as I say, I get it if you're not interested in it. But the exchanges between them are so funny because they're both writers. The wordplay in here is fabulous. Really, really funny. And the other element I think makes it worthy is you begin to see the elements that go on to construct his radical stuff 2 decades later, where what he does, he takes out the plot, he takes out the characters, he takes out the male priapism and just concentrates on, in here, what was in here, but he expands it out in his later works to factlets and little snippets about the lives of real artists. Here it's painter after painter after painter. In his later works he extends it to people from all walks of life who left behind, you know, quotes and things like that, or facts of their lives were recorded, such as their birth, their death, where they lived, if they ended up in a poorhouse or a madhouse, you know, whatever it was. So that begins to emerge in here. As I say, I thought it was an absolute blast, an absolute hoot. Yes, a lot of it could probably be seen as offensive in this day and age with our value system, but, you know, I was going to push past that because it's David Markson and I'm a devotee, and I wanted to see his journey, his writing journey of development. I now feel I have to read the pulp stuff, which I wasn't sold on before, but having read this, which seemed to come out from nowhere, I now need to see what the pulp stuff is like. So 5 stars. So that's it for this week. I'm not sure what I'm going to read next. I only finished, unfortunately, the Grudova yesterday, and I haven't picked anything up as yet. So till next time, thanks very much.